An entire award ceremony froze when a widowed actor collapsed on stage, unable to speak a single word about the woman he loved. No script could save him. No host knew what to do. And then Keanu Reeves stood up and did something no one in that room ever expected. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The award ceremony opened with the polished energy everyone expected. Cameras panned across glittering gowns and tuxedos. Spotlights swept the stage like slow-moving comets. Hosts exchanged practiced jokes that made the room ripple with polite laughter. But beneath all the glamour, there was an undertone in the air that no one could quite name. Even the applause felt slightly quieter than usual, as if the entire crowd sensed something heavier waiting behind the curtains. Keanu Reeves arrived quietly through a back entrance, choosing the path most presenters ignored. He wore a simple black suit with no embellishments, the same style he had worn to dozens of events over the years. No jewelry, no designer flash, no attention-drawing flourish. His posture was relaxed, his steps unhurried, and the only person with him was a single assistant carrying the presentation envelope for the small award he was assigned to present. Most people didn't notice him enter. That was exactly how he liked it. He took his seat near the center of the hall, close enough to see the stage clearly, but far enough from the spotlight to remain almost invisible. As the hosts moved through their opening monologue, Keanu's eyes wandered to the side of the room where a round table sat half in shadow. There alone, and gripping a neatly folded handkerchief, was Harold Bennett. Harold was a name older Hollywood cherished. His films from the 1970s were still shown in acting classes. His stage performances had been legendary. But tonight, Harold looked nothing like the vibrant man captured in countless movie posters. His shoulders slumped, his eyes were swollen. The handkerchief in his palm trembled even when he held it tightly. The grief around him was so palpable that Keanu could almost feel it pressing into the air. Backstage staff passing behind Harold exchanged quiet looks. Their whispers carried faintly into the crowd. They talked about the memorial tribute planned for later, the one Harold insisted on delivering himself. Everyone knew he had lost his wife only 2 months ago. Everyone knew he had barely spoken publicly since. But no one knew whether Harold had the strength to stand in front of thousands of people and speak about the woman who had been the center of his world. Keanu sensed the emotional tension forming like clouds before a storm. He watched Harold closely, feeling an unspoken heaviness beginning to settle across the room. The ceremony moved forward with the expected rhythm, but the mood never fully lifted. Even when a young comedian delivered a lively sketch that usually would have had the room laughing loudly, the audience responded with soft smiles instead. The atmosphere felt suspended between celebration and sorrow. Keanu felt it with every passing moment. He noticed how often people glanced toward Harold's table, how their expressions shifted when they saw him still gripping the same handkerchief, still breathing in shallow, uneven waves. At one point, a producer quietly approached Harold and crouched beside him. Their conversation was too soft to hear, but the producer's face revealed everything. He wasn't talking business. He was checking if Harold was sure, if he felt ready, if he needed someone else to step in. But Harold shook his head. He pressed the handkerchief to his lips and nodded firmly, determined to honor his wife in his own voice. The producer placed a supportive hand on Harold's shoulder before slowly walking away. A few minutes later, a tribute montage played for a different honoree, and the audience applauded politely. But Keanu wasn't focused on the screen. He kept looking at Harold, studying the man's breathing, the stiff set of his jaw, the way he blinked too often, as if holding back tears he refused to let fall before his moment on stage. Keanu recognized that kind of restraint. It was the same kind he had seen in people carrying deep grief while trying to appear strong for the sake of others. It was a fragile shield that could crack with a single tremor. From the stage wings, crew members whispered again. Much of what they said was drowned out by the ongoing program, but phrases drifted through the soft music and applause. Words like unstable, not ready, and heartbreaking floated through the air. Even from the audience, Keanu could tell they were preparing contingency plans, a backup speaker, a shortened segment, a discreet signal to move forward if Harold broke down. But they were also trying to respect him. It was a delicate balance they weren't sure how to keep. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but observant. Something inside him tightened with quiet concern. He didn't know what would happen, but he felt the room bracing itself for an emotional moment none of them could control. And Harold sat alone at the center of it, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff while no one could reach him yet. As another award recipient delivered a cheerful acceptance speech, Harold remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the stage without truly seeing it. He looked like someone trying to gather every ounce of courage left in him, yet losing strength with each passing minute. The contrast between his stillness and the celebratory mood around him made the moment even more fragile, as if the entire room were balancing on a thread stretched too thin. Keanu watched closely, sensing the weight gathering around Harold with every beat of the ceremony. Keanu had seen similar moments before, not in award shows, but in quiet corners of life where grief refused to stay hidden. He knew the look of someone standing at the edge of emotional collapse, desperately trying to keep themselves from falling. Harold's hands tightened around the handkerchief until his knuckles turned pale. His breath hitched every few minutes, small signs that most people in the room overlooked. But Keanu noticed. He noticed everything. Eventually, the host made an announcement that caused the atmosphere to shift again. They mentioned Harold Bennett's upcoming memorial tribute, praising his long career, his iconic performances, and the love story that had defined much of his life. The crowd applauded respectfully, but there was a softness to the sound, like applause wrapped in caution. Every person knew this tribute was personal, deeply emotional, and nearly impossible for a grieving man to deliver so soon after losing the woman who had shared his entire world. When Harold heard his name, he closed his eyes for a long moment, steadying himself. His chest rose and fell slowly, the way someone prepares for something painful but necessary. Keanu saw the slight tremble run through Harold's arm when he tried to place the handkerchief back into his pocket. His attempt to hide it only made the vulnerability more visible. The lights dimmed for a brief stage transition, and a soft, instrumental track began to play. The room fell into a hushed anticipation. Everyone knew the tribute would come soon. Everyone felt the quiet tension curling through the air. Keanu leaned forward slightly in his seat, his attention completely fixed on Harold. Something inside him told him that this night would not go as smoothly as planned. He could feel the emotional storm building, rising slowly but powerfully, preparing to break open the moment Harold stepped onto the stage. Before Harold Bennett became the fragile figure sitting alone at the edge of the ceremony, he had been one of the most respected performers of his generation. His rise began in the early 1970s when he stunned audiences with a unique blend of gentleness and raw intensity that made every scene he touched feel alive. Critics often said Harold didn't act. He allowed people to see his soul. But what made his work unforgettable was not just his talent. It was the presence of his wife, Margaret, who had been both his grounding force and his fiercest supporter. Harold met Margaret in a small theater company in New York when they were both struggling young performers. He was quiet, shy, and deeply insecure about his abilities. She was confident, warm, and unafraid to speak her mind. They balanced each other effortlessly. While Harold doubted himself constantly, Margaret would stand backstage and whisper encouragements that he carried with him for the rest of his life. Their partnership became legendary long before their fame did. They performed side by side for years, and audiences fell in love with the way they looked at each other on stage. That look didn't come from acting. It came from a lifetime of shared devotion. As Harold's career grew, he refused to take on any project that kept him away from Margaret for too long. They traveled together. They worked together. They founded a small charity supporting aging theater actors who struggled financially after leaving the industry. When Harold spoke in interviews, he never talked about success without mentioning Margaret's name. By the time they reached their 70s, people in the industry joked that you could never say Harold Bennett without immediately thinking of Margaret Bennett. They were a matched pair, two halves of a long, extraordinary story. Then cancer appeared slowly at first, then suddenly all-consuming. Harold rarely left her side during the final months. He fed her, read to her, and held her hand through every long night. When she passed, the world lost an artist, but Harold lost the person who had shaped every chapter of his life. He withdrew completely. He turned down interviews, appearances, and tributes. He stopped responding to colleagues who reached out. No one knew if he would ever return to public life again. When the producers of the awards ceremony reached out to Harold, they did so gently, unsure whether he would even respond. They told him there would be a short memorial segment honoring Margaret's contributions to the arts, along with a slideshow of her most iconic performances. They made it clear that he was not required to attend, and they certainly did not expect him to speak. They simply wanted him to know that Margaret would be remembered with dignity. To their surprise, Harold wrote back. He said he wanted to deliver the tribute himself, not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a husband who had loved Margaret for more than 50 years. His decision startled everyone around him. Friends worried that the grief was still too raw. His longtime manager visited him several times in the weeks leading up to the event, gently suggesting that someone else could read the tribute on his behalf. But Harold refused. He said Margaret had once told him that the stories people leave behind only stay alive when spoken by those who knew their heart. He felt it was his responsibility to keep her memory warm, even if the words broke him as he spoke them. In the days before the ceremony, Harold practiced the speech at home, reading it aloud in an empty living room that still felt filled with Margaret's presence. Sometimes he made it through a sentence, sometimes he didn't. Grief kept rising up like a wave, drowning out the words he wanted to say. He would pause, breathe, and try again. But the closer the ceremony came, the more painful the rehearsals became. He started whispering the lines instead of speaking them, as if reducing the volume of his voice might soften the sharpness of the memories attached to every sentence. By the time the event arrived, Harold wasn't confident anymore. He wasn't ready. He wasn't even sure he could stand on the stage without collapsing. But he came anyway. He arrived early, sat quietly at his table, and clutched the handkerchief Margaret had sewn for him decades earlier. As the ceremony unfolded around him, he rehearsed the lines under his breath, though his voice trembled every time he reached her name. He felt the weight of the moment pressing into him, pushing at the fragile parts of his heart he tried so hard to hide. Keanu watched Harold from across the room, noticing details others were too distracted to see. He saw the way Harold's fingers tapped lightly against the handkerchief, not with nervous energy, but with the aching rhythm of someone trying to anchor himself. He saw how Harold kept looking down at a folded sheet of paper on the table, then looking away before he could read it. He saw how Harold's shoulders rose with each deep breath, as if he were lifting something far heavier than air. Keanu had witnessed grief before. He knew how it hollowed the lungs and tightened the throat. He knew how it could take a person's voice without warning. Watching Harold now, he sensed the man wasn't simply preparing for a difficult speech. He was trying to survive it. Every moment revealed another crack in the facade Harold was desperately trying to maintain. It was in the tension of his jaw, the stiffness in his spine, the distant glaze in his eyes each time the ceremony became too loud around him. As the host announced the approaching tribute segment, the lights shifted once more, dimming just enough to draw attention to the screen behind the stage. The shift made Harold flinch. He lowered his head almost as if bracing himself for impact. Under his breath, he whispered Margaret's name. Keanu couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the silent plea in the movement of Harold's lips. It was the look of someone trying to summon strength from a memory instead of from himself. Others in the audience sensed the heaviness, but didn't fully grasp it. They saw a grieving husband. Keanu saw a man moments away from breaking open. The difference was subtle, but for someone like Keanu, who understood quiet suffering better than most, it felt unmistakable. He leaned forward slightly instinctively, tuning out the ceremony's noise. Every instinct told him Harold was barely holding on. He didn't know what form the collapse would take or when it would hit. He only knew the moment was coming, and Harold would be standing alone under blinding lights when it arrived. The music for the memorial segment began softly signaling that Harold's moment was seconds away. Keanu watched him straighten his fragile posture, forcing himself to rise when everything inside him seemed to resist. Harold's grief wasn't just visible now, it was overwhelming. And as he stepped toward the stage, Keanu sensed the inevitable unfolding in front of him. The moment the lights dimmed, a stillness swept through the auditorium. Conversation stopped mid-whisper. Glasses were set down softly. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade as the large screen behind the stage flickered to life. The first image appeared in elegant black and white Margaret Bennett at 23, smiling with a quiet confidence that radiated through the grainy photo. Her eyes held the same warmth people remembered from her earliest films, the same spark that had drawn audiences to her decades ago. The room almost sighed at the sight of her, as if everyone in attendance felt a collective ache for a woman they had never truly known, but whose presence had shaped Harold's entire life. More photos followed, Margaret on stage in her first Broadway production, Margaret laughing behind the scenes of an early Hollywood set, Margaret holding Harold's face in her hands during an emotional scene from their first film together. Each image deepened the silence in the room, building a tender reverence that felt larger than the ceremony itself. Clips from their later movies appeared next, showing Harold and Margaret performing side by side, moving with the natural chemistry of two people whose love was impossible to fake. The montage captured 5 decades of partnership in a way that words never could. It reminded everyone that they weren't just watching a tribute, they were witnessing a lifetime. As the images faded, Harold rose slowly from his seat. A stage assistant approached to guide him, but he gently waved her off, determined to walk the few steps alone. Even so, his movements were unsteady. Each step carried the weight of a man walking through memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. When he reached the stage, he leaned slightly on the podium, steadying himself with trembling fingers. His eyes wandered across the audience, but didn't land anywhere. It was clear he wasn't seeing faces. He was seeing moments, echoes, pieces of a life that now felt impossibly distant. The cue card on the podium read 3-minute personal remembrance, simple instructions for what should have been a short, heartfelt tribute. But Harold wasn't thinking about time. He wasn't thinking about the program. He was thinking about Margaret and the space she once filled beside him. The silence grew heavier as he opened his mouth to speak. The moment Harold tried to speak, his voice cracked so sharply that the microphone picked up the break like a sudden tear in fabric. He cleared his throat and tried again, but the same tremor returned stronger this time. The breath he attempted to draw in stuttered halfway, trapped somewhere between his ribs and the grief tightening around his chest. A few people in the front row instinctively leaned forward, as if willing their support toward him, but Harold's eyes remained fixed on the paper in his hand. The letters blurred, swimming behind tears he could no longer hold back. He pressed the handkerchief to his mouth, attempting to steady himself. But the more he fought to regain control, the more overwhelmed he became. The theater, once a vast and dignified space, seemed to close in around him. It felt smaller, heavier, suffocating, as if every memory of Margaret was pressing onto his shoulders all at once. Harold blinked rapidly, trying to regain some composure, but the attempt only made his tears fall faster. His lower lip quivered as he tried to form the first word of his prepared speech. Nothing came out. His fingers curled tighter around the podium. His shoulders began to shake. And then, in a moment so raw, it felt almost too intimate to witness, Harold broke. A soft, helpless sound escaped him, a sound that came from a place deeper than grief, from a heart that had been shattered and was trying desperately to speak through the pieces. The camera close-up revealed his hand trembling violently, the wedding ring on his finger catching the stage light like a small, fragile reminder of everything he had lost. The audience didn't breathe. No one dared move. It felt like the entire room had been swallowed by his sorrow. Even the host, who stood off to the side waiting for his cue, froze mid-step. He tried to approach discreetly, hoping to offer Harold a moment of support or a graceful way to step back, but before he could take more than 2 steps forward, something unexpected happened. Keanu, seated a few rows behind Harold's table, raised a gentle hand. The gesture was calm, subtle, but filled with meaning. It silently said, "Give him a moment." And the host stopped where he was unsure, but trusting the quiet authority behind that simple motion. Harold tried one last time to steady his breath, tilting his head upward as if searching the ceiling for the strength he could not find within himself. The lights reflected softly across his tear-filled eyes, making the grief on his face unmistakable to every person in the room. When he finally lowered his gaze back toward the audience, his expression revealed a truth that needed no words. He wasn't simply overwhelmed, he was lost. The memories he intended to honor had opened wider wounds than he expected, and now he stood exposed before thousands of people who suddenly felt like witnesses to a private moment they weren't meant to see. The screen behind him, still glowing with the last image of Margaret, only deepened his struggle. It showed her smiling during a backstage interview, a smile filled with life and joy. Harold turned slightly and saw it too. His chest tightened. His shoulders curled inward, as though trying to protect the part of himself that had always belonged to her. He reached up and touched the edge of the podium again, gripping it with both hands, this time the gesture small but full of desperation. For a moment, it looked as if he might collapse entirely. A soft murmur rippled across the auditorium, not of impatience, but of collective heartbreak. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to look away or continue watching. Some wiped their own tears, others clasped their hands in front of their mouths. The silence that filled the hall was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. It wrapped around Harold like a thick fog that made every breath harder to take. The host remained frozen where Keanu had quietly stopped him moments earlier, torn between his instinct to help and his awareness that this wasn't a moment that needed interruption. It needed understanding. Keanu's raised hand had communicated something deeper than a simple request. It had acknowledged the sacredness of grief, the importance of giving Harold space to try, even if trying meant breaking down. Keanu understood that rushing in too quickly might turn Harold's pain into spectacle rather than allowing him dignity. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on Harold, steady and compassionate. He didn't move yet, but everything about his posture suggested readiness. He could see that Harold was nearing a breaking point no one else fully recognized. And while the audience remained frozen in uncertainty, Keanu was quietly preparing for what he felt was coming next. An unspoken collapse that would change the course of the night. Harold steadied himself for another attempt, lifting his chin as if gathering whatever strength still remained in him. The audience watched with hopeful stillness, willing him to find his voice. He opened his mouth, ready to push through the tremor in his chest, but the words once again refused to come. Instead, his breath faltered, his throat tightened, the air caught halfway, making his next inhale uneven and shaky. He blinked several times, trying to clear the tears blurring his vision, but the movement only made them spill faster. He tried again, forcing the first syllable of his wife's name past the barrier of grief. It came out as little more than a broken whisper. The microphone amplified the softness, turning it into something even more intimate than the room expected. The sound of her name falling from his lips fractured what little strength he had left. His knees weakened beneath him. His body swayed slightly, and he gripped the podium with both hands, fingers digging into the wood so tightly the skin around his knuckles drained of all color. A soft gasp spread through the front rows as people realized he was losing control. Harold leaned forward as if trying to brace himself against a wave that had finally become too powerful to resist. His shoulders shook, his breathing turned unsteady and loud enough to echo faintly through the speakers. His eyes shut tightly as he whispered Margaret's name again, this time with a trembling desperation that broke the last of his composure. Then he collapsed emotionally, completely and painfully. His face crumpled, his body folded inwards. The handkerchief slipped from his grasp as he lifted both hands to cover his face. The gesture was instinctive, the way someone might shield themselves during a fall. The audience erupted into a quiet panic. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others bowed their heads, overwhelmed by his anguish. A few wiped tears from their eyes, unable to watch without feeling the weight of his sorrow. The camera, still focused on him, captured every second of the breakdown. It zoomed in slightly, showing the way his shoulders shook and the way his hands pressed desperately against his face, as if trying to keep himself from shattering further. It was the kind of moment that stripped away the distance between performer and audience. This wasn't acting. This wasn't ceremony. This was grief exposed under blinding lights, and no one knew how to help him stand under its weight. The host instinctively stepped forward again, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. His expression showed conflict. He wanted to help, yet he feared that interrupting would only deepen Harold's humiliation. He took a cautious half-step toward the stage, lifting his cue cards as if they might provide a dignified way to transition. But he froze once more. Everyone in the room felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Interrupting Harold now would feel wrong, almost intrusive, yet letting him remain alone in his collapse seemed even worse. Backstage, stage managers moved quickly toward the wings, whispering urgent instructions to each other. Some motioned to cut the segment short. Others gestured toward the teleprompter as if sending a supportive message might help. But no one could decide on a solution that didn't feel cold or procedural. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't a timing issue. This was a man being crushed by a lifetime's worth of love and loss in front of thousands of people. No script existed for a moment like this. Audience members exchanged worried glances, unsure of what they were witnessing or what was supposed to happen next. The collective silence turned heavy, almost unbearable. A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes with a small tissue. A director seated near the aisle bowed his head in respect, unable to look any longer. Even those who had never met Harold felt the emotional force of his grief shatter through the boundaries of the stage and into the crowd. Harold's legs bent slightly as if they might give out completely. He leaned harder on the podium, his hands trembling as they lowered from his face. When he finally looked up, his expression was not one of embarrassment, but one of utter devastation. His eyes were red and swollen. His mouth quivered. He tried to speak once more, but the effort only produced a faint, broken breath that cracked mid-sound. It became painfully clear to everyone in the room that Harold could not continue. He could not even begin. The emotions inside him were overflowing with no outlet but tears. His body shook uncontrollably, and the audience could feel his heart break in the silence between each trembling inhale. No one could offer comfort from the distance of their seats. No words could reach him from behind the lights. And yet, someone would have to step forward. Someone would have to save him from collapsing entirely under the weight of that moment. Harold's body swayed again, his strength nearly gone. He clutched the podium with both hands, as if it were the last solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted beneath him. The handkerchief lay forgotten on the stage floor, a small white square that somehow made the moment feel even more fragile. Harold whispered Margaret's name one more time, but this time the sound barely formed. It was more breath than voice, a final attempt from a man searching desperately for the woman he no longer had beside him. A few people in the audience gasped softly. They recognized that trembling posture, the slight bend in Harold's knees. He wasn't just emotional, he was moments away from physical collapse. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Someone reached out instinctively toward the stage, though they were too far to offer any real support. Another person placed a hand over their heart. A man in the balcony muttered a quiet prayer. The energy in the auditorium shifted from anticipation to urgent concern. The host, still frozen at the side of the stage, looked toward the wings with wide, uncertain eyes. One of the stage managers gestured for him to intervene. Another shook her head, unsure whether stepping in would fracture what little dignity Harold still held. They argued in frantic whispers, each one trying to make a decision that felt humane, yet neither could decide on the right course of action. There were no guidelines for this moment, no fallback plan, no page in the program designed to address a man breaking open under the weight of love and grief. Harold bent forward slightly, both hands pressed against his face again. His shoulders caved inward, shaking violently as tears poured freely down his cheeks. The microphone picked up the uneven rhythm of his breaths, turning his heartbreak into a sound the entire room could feel. It was no longer a tribute. It was a cry for the person he had lost. And every second he remained on that stage alone felt like a deeper wound. Keanu had been watching closely from his seat, his eyes steady, his expression filled with quiet concern. He saw the exact moment Harold's strength slipped from him, like a final thread breaking. He understood instantly that Harold could not stand there any longer. He understood that no stage manager, no host, no procedural fix could salvage what was happening. And that was when Keanu made a decision that would change the entire night. Keanu watched Harold's collapse with an intensity that came from instinct rather than strategy. He could feel the exact moment Harold's strength slipped beyond recovery. The trembling in Harold's hands, the helpless fold of his shoulders, the quiet, broken whisper of Margaret's name. These were not signs of a man who needed a cue or a prompt. These were signs of someone drowning in grief, with no way to surface on his own. And Keanu understood with a certainty that reached into his chest that Harold could not remain alone on that stage for another second. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't look at the cameras or the audience or the stage managers who were frozen in indecision. He simply reached down, placed the award envelope he had been holding on his seat, and stood up. His movements were steady and unhurried, not designed for spectacle or attention. He didn't rush, and he didn't make a scene. He rose with a quiet determination, the kind that came from seeing someone in pain and knowing the only right choice was to move. At first, only the people sitting near him noticed. They glanced up puzzled, trying to understand what he was doing. This was not his segment. He was not scheduled to appear until much later. Yet there he was, walking down the aisle with a calm, grounded presence that contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos on the stage. His steps were slow but purposeful. He did not look around. His eyes remained fixed on Harold, as if the rest of the room no longer existed. As he approached the front rows, whispers began to ripple through the audience. People leaned slightly toward the aisle, watching him move with a gentleness that softened the tension in the room. There was no dramatic flair in the way he walked, no urgency, no attempt to command attention. It was the simplicity of his posture that made the moment powerful. It told the audience that this wasn't a performance. It wasn't an actor stepping into a spotlight. This was a human being walking toward another human being who was breaking. Harold lifted his head just enough to see movement in his peripheral vision. When he realized who was approaching him, something in his expression changed. His shoulders dropped as if a small piece of the crushing weight inside him had suddenly eased. Harold blinked through his tears as Keanu reached the steps leading up to the stage. For a moment, Harold looked confused, almost disoriented, as though he couldn't quite believe someone was approaching him with such calm intention. But the confusion faded quickly. The recognition in Harold's eyes softened into something else, relief, fragile and unmistakable. That small shift in his expression was enough to confirm that Keanu's instinct had been right. Harold did not need a replacement speaker or a rushed transition. He needed someone beside him, someone steady enough to hold the space he could no longer carry alone. Keanu climbed the final step with quiet confidence and crossed the short distance to Harold. His presence on stage changed the energy in the room instantly. The tension that had suffocated the audience only moments earlier seemed to loosen, replaced by a tender anticipation. The cameras repositioned almost cautiously, unsure whether they were capturing part of the program or something far more personal. Stage managers halted their frantic motions. Even the host stopped breathing for a moment, watching as Keanu stepped up beside Harold. When Keanu reached him, he didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a dramatic gesture or a sweeping embrace. He simply laid a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder, a touch so soft and grounding that Harold's trembling slowed almost immediately. Harold's eyes closed as if that single gesture allowed his lungs to work again. His hands loosened their desperate grip on the podium and his shoulders lowered, no longer curled inward in anguish. Keanu leaned in not to take over the stage, not to redirect the moment, but to speak only to Harold. His voice was low enough that the microphone didn't catch it. Whatever words he shared were intended for Harold alone. Harold listened through wavering breaths, his face still wet with tears. Then slowly he nodded. It was a small nod, barely visible but full of meaning. It said he heard Keanu. It said he trusted him. It said he was not alone. The audience watched in stunned silence. There was no applause, no chatter, no confusion anymore. Everyone understood that something profoundly human was unfolding before them. Keanu, who had no obligation to be part of this moment, had become the anchor Harold needed just to remain standing. The entire room held its breath as Keanu remained beside Harold, steady and silent. He didn't rush to take the microphone. He didn't move to the podium. He didn't attempt to steer the moment or direct attention. He simply stood close enough for Harold to feel supported, a quiet presence offering strength without overshadowing him. Harold's shaking slowed a little more his posture, straightening just enough to show that he could breathe again now that he wasn't alone on the stage. A few people in the audience finally understood what they were witnessing. Some clasped their hands together, others exhaled in visible relief. A woman in the fifth row pressed a hand to her chest as tears pooled in her eyes. To her, to many others, it felt like they had just watched a drowning man find a lifeline. Not a rescue that demanded applause, but a lifeline, offered gently, respectfully, without fanfare. Harold opened his eyes and turned his head slightly toward Keanu. His expression was vulnerable, almost childlike in its sincerity. It held gratitude, exhaustion, and the faintest spark of safety returning to him. Keanu met his gaze with a soft, reassuring look that carried no pity, only understanding. He gave Harold a small nod, a silent message, telling him that he didn't have to go on alone, that it was all right to lean instead of stand. Harold's breathing steadied enough for him to speak, but instead of trying again, he simply whispered something to Keanu, barely audible even from a few feet away. Whatever it was, made Keanu respond with an even deeper gentleness. He shifted slightly closer, offering support without invading Harold's grief. The tenderness of the interaction spread through the room like a warm current after a long, cold silence. Everyone watched, unable to turn away. No one had expected Keanu to play any part in this moment. He had not been scheduled. He had not been asked. There was nothing in the program or the script that prepared anyone for the sight before them, a grieving husband collapsing under the weight of love, and a humble actor stepping quietly into the breach, not as a celebrity, not as a presenter, but as a human being choosing compassion over protocol. And in that stillness, just as the auditorium tried to process the shift they had witnessed, Keanu took a small breath as though preparing for something more. The night was about to change in a way no one had seen coming. Keanu remained close enough for Harold to feel supported, but not so close as to overwhelm him. The noise of the auditorium had faded to a quiet hum, almost as if the room itself was holding its breath. Keanu lowered his head slightly and leaned toward Harold, careful to keep the moment private despite the thousands of eyes watching. His voice when he spoke was barely more than a whisper, gentle and steady. Its softness meant only for Harold's ears. "I will speak for you if you let me." The words were simple, but they carried a profound sincerity. There was no performance in them, no intention of taking over or rescuing the show. It was an offer born entirely from compassion. Harold heard those words through his tears. His breath shuddered, and he lifted his trembling gaze toward Keanu. His eyes were swollen, red, exhausted, yet when he looked at Keanu, they held something new. They held trust. They held desperation. Most of all, they held a plea for relief from a burden he could no longer carry. Harold tried to speak, but the words dissolved before they reached his lips. So he nodded instead. It was a fragile, broken nod, the kind that said he could not endure another attempt alone. Keanu acknowledged the nod with a small, reassuring movement of his head. But instead of turning to the microphone or picking up Harold's fallen speech, he remained still. The audience waited, assuming Keanu would read the tribute on Harold's behalf. Stage managers braced themselves, expecting him to guide the ceremony back on track. But Keanu didn't reach for the podium. He didn't straighten his posture or prepare to deliver a speech. He stayed right beside Harold, his hand still resting lightly on the grieving man's shoulder. Something else was forming in Keanu's mind, something deeper than a replacement speech or a graceful transition. He remembered an old interview one he had seen years earlier while preparing for a role. Harold had talked about fear. Not stage fright or career anxieties, but the fear of losing the person he loved most. He had confessed that whenever he was scared, Margaret would sit beside him, hold his hand, and sing their song. Time after time. A song woven into their life like a thread of comfort and devotion. And Keanu knew exactly what he needed to do. Harold's nod lingered in the space between them, fragile and trembling, as if the small movement had taken every bit of courage he still possessed. Keanu held the moment gently, letting Harold breathe, letting the weight settle in a way that didn't crush him further. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't step toward the podium. He simply stayed beside Harold, his presence steady and grounded, giving Harold something solid to lean into. The audience, sensing the quiet shift, leaned inward as well. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply waited, held in the suspense of an unexpected pause. Keanu turned his gaze briefly toward the screen behind them. It was still frozen on a photo of Margaret smiling, glowing, radiating the warmth that Harold had described in that old interview. The expression she wore in the picture was the same one Harold had spoken about with trembling affection. It was the smile she gave him when he was frightened or uncertain, the smile that told him he wasn't alone. Keanu stared at it for a few seconds, and something like conviction settled into his posture. He glanced back at Harold, noticing how the man's breathing still shook beneath the surface. Harold's hands hovered uncertainly near the podium, as if he didn't know whether to hold it or let go. His body was a map of grief, each movement revealing the depth of emotion he could no longer contain. Keanu understood that even if he took the microphone and read Harold's speech word for word, it wouldn't soothe the pain echoing through Harold's chest. Words alone could not bridge that gap. He needed something else, something that reached deeper than the formal tribute Harold had written. Keanu drew in a soft breath, one that came naturally, not with dramatic intention. His hand remained on Harold's shoulder, and his posture relaxed just slightly, signaling his decision without saying a word. He did not announce his intention to the audience. He did not ask for permission. He didn't even look toward the host or the cameras. What he was about to do wasn't part of the program or the plan. It wasn't meant for applause or attention. It was meant for Harold. Only Harold. Keanu remembered Harold's interview vividly, the way the older man had spoken of Margaret's comfort song with a softness that suggested it had been woven into the very fabric of their marriage. And now, standing beside him on this stage, Keanu knew that invoking that memory was the only way to give Harold something resembling peace in this moment. Keanu let the silence settle for a final moment, allowing Harold to gather what little strength remained in him. The air around them felt charged, but not with tension anymore. It felt expectant, like the room itself sensed that something meaningful was about to unfold. Keanu took one more breath, calm and steady, grounding himself in the memory he carried. He glanced at Harold, offering one more silent reassurance, and then he shifted his weight slightly, signaling his intention without ever making a spectacle of it. Keanu didn't reach for the microphone. He didn't step in front of Harold or position himself at the podium. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, close enough for Harold to feel the comfort of another human presence, but still slightly to the side, leaving space for Margaret's memory to remain at the center of the moment. His chest rose gently as he prepared to speak, then lowered again as he realized that he didn't need words at all. What Harold needed was the thing he had lost, the thing Margaret had given him whenever he feared the world might swallow him whole, the thing that had steadied him during the hardest moments of his life. And Keanu, remembering the way Harold had spoken of their song, knew that speaking would never reach him the way singing could. So he didn't say anything. He didn't clear his throat or set up the moment. He simply allowed the silence to bloom for one more heartbeat, and then let the first soft note slip through his lips. It was quiet, almost fragile, the kind of sound that could have disappeared into the cavernous auditorium if it hadn't been carried by the microphone beside them. But the microphone barely seemed necessary. The room had gone so still that even a whisper felt like it could carry forever. Keanu's voice was unpolished, gentle, and deeply human. Not the voice of a trained singer delivering a performance, but the voice of someone offering comfort the only way he knew how. Harold's head lifted slowly. His eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. He knew the melody instantly. His breath caught in his throat as the familiar song washed over him, a song Margaret had sung to him in moments just like this, when fear and grief had threatened to take him under. And in that instant, Harold no longer looked like a man collapsing. He looked like a man remembering he was loved. The moment Keanu released the first soft note, the auditorium changed. The room once filled with the quiet panic of Harold's collapse seemed to exhale and fall into a deeper stillness. Every sound softened, every distraction dissolved. It was as if the entire ceremony paused to make space for something unexpectedly tender. Keanu's voice wasn't loud or polished. It wasn't the kind of voice meant to impress or command. It was warm, raw, and human, carried by the microphone only enough to reach the farthest corners of the hall without overwhelming anyone. His voice rose gently, flowing like a whisper, wrapped in light. Harold inhaled sharply, the sound catching in his chest before releasing as a trembling breath. His shoulders, which had been curled inward moments earlier, softened. The tension in his hands loosened. His trembling diminished with each lyric Keanu uttered. The melody was familiar, painfully familiar, but hearing it here in this place from this man struck Harold with a force that bypassed thought entirely. It reached him in the place grief lived, not with pressure, but with warmth. At first, the audience looked stunned. Keanu Reeves was not a scheduled performer. He had not rehearsed this. There was no cue card instructing him to sing. The camera operators hesitated, unsure whether to zoom in, cut away, or remain frozen. They kept their lenses steady, almost out of reverence, rather than protocol. A few stage managers exchanged looks filled with disbelief. The host remained frozen, where he stood, his cue cards sinking slowly toward his side. No one had expected this. No one had prepared for this. But slowly the shock gave way to something else. The softness in Keanu's voice, the sincerity, threaded through each note, wrapped itself around the audience, like a warm blanket drifting over a cold room. The harsh edges of the moment softened, replaced by the gentle rhythm of a man singing not to perform, but to comfort. The purity of it disarmed everyone. Harold closed his eyes. He didn't need to look at the audience. He didn't even need to look at Keanu. He simply let the melody settle into him, breathing deeper with each pass of the lyrics. For the first time since he stepped onto the stage, his body was no longer fighting itself. His breath steadied, his shoulders lowered, his face relaxed. It was as if for a brief and sacred moment, Margaret was beside him again, singing the same song she once used to soften his fear. As Keanu continued singing, the melody floated through the auditorium with a gentleness that almost didn't seem possible in such a large space. His voice carried a sincerity that pierced through the discomfort and sadness of the moment, transforming the atmosphere into something softer, something almost sacred. He wasn't trying to hit every note perfectly. He wasn't performing for cameras or critics. He was offering comfort the only way he could with a voice that carried more honesty than polish. Harold's breathing grew steadier with each passing lyric. The tremors that had overtaken his hands dissolved slowly as if the melody smoothed the jagged edges of his grief. His shoulders, once tight with emotion, loosened entirely. He leaned slightly toward the sound, drawn not by duty, but by memory. The song had been Margaret's touchstone, her offering of reassurance. Hearing it again, carried by another person's voice, reached a part of Harold he had thought was inaccessible since the day she died. The audience began to shift in their seats, not in restlessness, but in quiet awe. People who had been frozen with worry minutes before now softened visibly. Some tilted their heads, Others lowered their eyes. Many clutched tissues or pressed fingertips gently against trembling lips. Keanu's voice moved through the crowd like a warm breeze, through an open window, stirring something deep and universal, the ache of love loss and longing that every person feels at some point in their lives. Even the camera operators, trained to remain emotionally detached, felt the moment pull at them. Their hands steadied on their equipment, drawn into the tenderness unfolding on the stage. They framed the shot carefully, not zooming too close, afraid that invading the intimacy would somehow disturb the fragile miracle happening in front of them. Harold opened his eyes briefly. He turned his head slightly toward Keanu, as if to confirm the reality of what he was hearing. The expression on his face softened into something almost peaceful. His eyes, though still wet with tears, no longer held the frantic, lost look they had moments ago. Instead, they reflected a quiet surrender, a willingness to let the music hold him. Keanu continued singing, his voice steady but full of emotion. Each note carried the tenderness of someone who understood pain and offered empathy instead of solutions. Each lyric reached deeper, unraveling the tightness in Harold's chest and reminding him of something he had thought he'd never feel again, the sensation of being comforted. As the song unfolded, the auditorium seemed to transform into a quieter, more intimate place. The lights felt softer. The tension that had once gripped the room dissolved into a collective emotional stillness. Every lyric that left Keanu's lips carried a gentle weight, as if it were being delivered directly to Harold, rather than the thousands quietly watching. The simplicity of the moment made it powerful. It wasn't choreographed. It wasn't scripted. It was a moment born entirely from empathy. Harold's eyes remained closed now, not in pain, but in remembrance. His breathing rose and fell with the rhythm of the song, steady and deep. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, he no longer looked like a man fighting to stay upright. He looked like someone finally allowed to rest. The song wrapped around him with the familiarity of Margaret's embrace, reminding him of nights when she had sung the same melody to ease his fear or calm his spirit. Through the fog of grief, Harold felt her presence again, not in the form of memory alone, but in the way Keanu's voice carried her warmth back into the room. The audience, now fully aware of the meaning behind the song, felt its significance ripple through them. Many were moved to tears without realizing it. Some placed comforting hands on the shoulders of those beside them. Others clasped their hands together as though witnessing something sacred. The song was no longer just for Harold. It had become a balm for everyone listening, a reminder of the people they loved, the ones they had lost, or the ones they feared losing. Meanwhile, Keanu remained steady. His eyes did not drift toward the cameras or the crowd. He kept them gently focused either on Harold or on a point slightly downward, anchoring himself in the tenderness of the moment. There was no bravado in his posture, only humility, only kindness. His voice remained soft, almost fragile, yet unwavering in its devotion to the man standing beside him. The final notes of the verse floated through the hall like warm breath on a cold window. As the sound lingered, Harold's trembling had fully disappeared. His shoulders rested peacefully, his face softened. He looked no longer like a widower collapsing under the weight of memory, but like a man feeling held, uplifted, carried by a song he thought he would never hear again. In those quiet seconds, the audience understood something profound. This wasn't a performance. It was healing. As Keanu's voice drifted through the final lines of the verse, the room's silence began to shift. It wasn't the restless kind of movement that happens when people lose attention. It was something gentler, something rising, almost like the stirring of a collective breath. In the back row, a single audience member stood, slowly moved by something they couldn't quite describe. Their posture wasn't rigid or ceremonial. It was soft, respectful, as though standing was the only way their heart knew how to answer what was happening on stage. A few seats over, someone else rose, then another, and another. The movement spread not with urgency, but with reverence. People stood the way one rises when a loved one enters a room or a sacred moment unfolds. It happed in waves, one row at a time, the emotions traveling from person to person, pulling them upward almost involuntarily. Soon, an entire section of the auditorium was on its feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing in quiet solidarity. Toward the front, a well-known filmmaker wiped his eyes before rising. Behind him, a group of young performers stood as well, their expressions soft, their breathing unsteady. Even those who had never met Harold felt the weight of the song reach into them, reminding them of people they had lost or moments they still carried in their hearts. The scene was no longer about a tribute or an award show. It had shifted into something deeper, something closer to a shared confession of grief and love. The cameras struggled to keep up. One operator, visibly moved, steadied the lens with trembling hands. Another wiped her cheeks quickly before returning to her viewfinder. They filmed the room with a careful touch, capturing not just faces, but emotions. The tears on cheeks, the quivering lips, the soft gazes filled with memory. Stagehands, who had been rushing minutes earlier, now stood motionless in the wings, their equipment forgotten for the moment as they watched with awe. At the center of it all, Harold stood beside Keanu, eyes still gently closed. He didn't yet know that the audience had risen for him, but he could feel the shift in the air, the quiet warmth enveloping him from every direction. It no longer felt like he was standing alone under the weight of the lights. It felt like the entire room was holding him up. As Keanu continued singing, the rising movement spread through the auditorium like a slow, gentle tide. More people stood row after row until the scattered pockets of standing figures blended into a unified wave of support. The room began to glow with an almost sacred energy, the kind that emerges only when hundreds of hearts respond to the same unspoken truth. No one instructed them to rise. No producer cued it. It came from something deeper, something human, something shared. Some of the audience members began joining in, their voices soft and hesitant at first. A woman near the center murmured the lyrics through her tears. A man in the balcony, voice trembling, echoed the harmony. Soon, the delicate thread of Keanu's singing was supported by dozens of quiet voices, some young, some old, some trained, some untrained, all blending with a sincerity that made the moment feel overwhelmingly real. No one tried to overpower him. No one tried to turn it into a performance. They sang gently, as if singing to someone they loved. Couples clasped hands. Friends leaned into each other. Strangers exchanged tearful glances that silently acknowledged the grief each person carried. In the third row, an actress pressed her forehead to her hand as she sang, tears soaking the sleeve of her gown. Behind her, a veteran filmmaker removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his jacket cuff, unwilling to look away even for a second. A stagehand standing near the curtains covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the sight of grown men and women finding solace together through a single song. The cameras captured it all, but even through the lenses, the operators felt the moment rather than observing it. They zoomed out slowly, respectfully, revealing the vastness of the room rising as one. Nothing about it resembled a typical awards show. The glamour had faded. The competition had vanished. All that remained was a raw humanity that connected everyone present. Keanu's voice remained steady, guiding the room like a gentle beacon. Standing beside him, Harold finally opened his eyes. The sight before him stole his breath, not through shock, but through wonder. Every person in the auditorium, every seat from the front row to the furthest balcony was standing for him, standing for Margaret, standing for grief itself. The song had turned into something larger than any one person could hold alone, and Harold, witnessing the unexpected unity, felt something inside him soften into warmth he thought he'd lost forever. Harold's gaze swept slowly across the room, disbelief softening into something deeper and more tender with each passing second. He had come to the ceremony expecting to endure his grief alone under the bright, unforgiving lights of the stage. Instead, he found himself held by a room full of strangers who were no longer strangers at all. Their faces, once distant and polished with red carpet confidence, were now open, vulnerable, and full of shared emotion. The song had woven them into a single tapestry of memory, and compassion. Keanu felt the shift too, though he kept his focus steady. His voice remained gentle, guiding the melody with the same intention that had lifted Harold back from the edge. He didn't look out at the audience rising around him. He didn't register the cameras capturing every angle. He simply sang with a sincerity that made the moment feel intimate despite the thousands of eyes watching. The harmony that now floated around him wasn't an interruption. It was a completion, a collective offering of comfort. Near the stage, a pair of actors who had worked with Harold years ago reached out and clasped each other's hands. In the aisle, a producer who rarely showed emotion wiped her cheeks with the back of her wrist as she mouthed the lyrics. In the balcony, a young couple intertwined their fingers, singing softly despite barely knowing the tune. It didn't matter whether they knew Margaret personally. The feeling in the air connected them to Harold's loss in a way words never could. The stagehands in the wings, usually preoccupied with cues and timing, stood completely still. One of them removed his headset, unable to focus on anything except the scene unfolding before his eyes. Another leaned forward, arms resting on her knees, her expression softened by the same warmth spreading through the room. Even the technical crew who lived behind the scenes felt drawn into the emotional current. And all the while, Harold stood beside Keanu, breathing steadily for the first time since stepping onto the stage. The music wrapped around him like a protective embrace. The voices rising around him soothed the jagged edges of his grief. He closed his eyes again, but this time it wasn't to hold back tears. It was to absorb the love he felt surrounding him. What had begun as a moment of collapse had become a moment of healing. A spontaneous, unplanned ceremony of unity, born not from rehearsed emotions, but from the collective heart of everyone in the room. As the song reached its emotional peak, Harold's body finally surrendered to the moment. He leaned fully into Keanu's shoulder, not out of weakness, but out of the deep human need to rest somewhere safe after carrying too much for too long. Keanu shifted slightly to support him steady and grounded. The gesture was natural, almost instinctive, the way a friend might offer a shoulder to someone who had fought too hard to stay upright. Harold's trembling quieted as he allowed himself to lean, to be held, to stop resisting the grief he'd been trying to contain. His tears softened, no longer violent, no longer gasping. They flowed gently, like the slow release of pain that had been building for months. The tightness in his chest loosened with every breath he drew in. The song had opened a door inside him that had been locked since Margaret's passing, and now the grief that poured out felt less like drowning and more like release. His breaths, once sharp and uneven, grew steadier, aligning themselves with the rhythm of Keanu's quiet singing and the soft harmony floating through the room. When Harold finally opened his eyes, they reflected something new. Not joy, not relief, but a fragile mixture of pain and peace. The kind of peace that comes when someone lifts the weight off your shoulders for just long enough to let you breathe again. His gaze, still blurred with tears, moved from the audience to the glowing photo of Margaret on the screen. For the first time that night, it didn't break him. It simply warmed him, as if the memory had shifted from unbearable to tender. Keanu's voice continued steady and comforting until the last soft note drifted into the air and gently faded. The room became completely still. No applause, no murmurs, just a long, reverent silence, as though the audience collectively understood that clapping too soon would break something delicate that had just been repaired. They let the silence linger, honoring not just the performance, but the love, grief, and healing woven into it. In that silence, Harold drew a long, steady breath, one deeper and calmer than any he had taken since stepping onto the stage. He closed his eyes again, leaning once more into Keanu's shoulder, finally feeling that he didn't have to stand alone. The silence stretched softly across the auditorium, not awkward, but sacred. People didn't dare move. They didn't even shift in their seats. It felt as though the entire room had collectively placed their hands over their hearts, holding the moment gently so it wouldn't slip away too quickly. Harold, still resting against Keanu, breathed in slow, steady intervals, each inhale carrying less weight, each exhale releasing more of the grief that had suffocated him minutes earlier. Keanu didn't move either. He didn't straighten. He didn't step away. He stayed exactly where he was, allowing Harold to rest fully against him. His posture didn't demand attention. It didn't lean toward the audience or the cameras. It leaned toward Harold, only Harold keeping his presence as a pillar of calm for the man who finally had room to fall apart safely. Keanu's hand gently tightened on Harold's shoulder, a simple, silent reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. The lights above softened even further, dimming just enough to take the edge off the stage's brightness. This wasn't planned. A lighting technician backstage, overcome by the emotion of the moment, reacted instinctively and lowered the intensity to create a softer glow. The gentleness of the lighting made the stage look less like a platform and more like a sanctuary, a place where Harold was allowed to be human instead of composed. Shadows softened, colors warmed, and the entire room seemed to exhale again. Finally, after what felt like a shared heartbeat suspended in time, Harold lifted his head just slightly. His eyes were glassy but not frantic. His expression held exhaustion, yes, but also a profound, quiet gratitude. He swallowed hard, trying to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Keanu waited patient and unhurried. Harold tried again, and this time a faint whisper escaped. "You made my heart breathe again." The sentence trembled, but its meaning pulsed through the air with undeniable clarity. Keanu's expression softened even further. He squeezed Harold's hand, a gentle acknowledgement that he had heard every layer of truth behind those 7 words. It wasn't praise. It wasn't flattery. It was a confession of revival, the kind that comes from being seen, understood, and held when most needed. The audience, though they couldn't hear the whisper, saw Harold's expression change. They saw the relief in his face. They saw Keanu's quiet response. And together, they felt the profound shift that had taken place. Harold's whisper lingered in the space between them, fragile, yet powerful enough to reshape the entire room. Even without hearing the exact words, the audience sensed the meaning. They saw the shift in Harold's posture, the release in his face, the quiet gratitude radiating from him. It was clear that something inside him had settled, something that had been trembling uncontrollably until Keanu reached out and steadied it. Harold leaned gently against Keanu once more, no longer collapsing, simply resting, finally allowed to breathe openly without fear of breaking. Keanu remained beside him, offering the same unwavering presence, the same steady warmth. He didn't look out at the audience or the cameras. He didn't signal for applause or attention. His eyes remained focused on Harold, grounded in compassion. Keanu understood that the song had done more than soothe Harold's trembling. It had reached into the deepest part of his grief and offered a moment of peace he thought he would never be able to feel again. That peace needed protecting, not rushing. The audience seemed to understand that as well. When applause finally came, it wasn't loud or celebratory. It rose gently like a soft breeze sweeping through the room. People clapped with open hands, not seeking to interrupt the moment, but to honor it. The sound was light, respectful, filled with empathy rather than excitement. It acknowledged Harold's pain, Keanu's kindness, and the healing that had just unfolded before their eyes. Some in the crowd continued to wipe tears as they clapped. Others held their hands to their chest, but no one rushed the moment. The applause honored the fragility of what had just taken place. Harold turned his head slightly toward Keanu, resting it lightly against his shoulder. It was not the gesture of a broken man anymore. It was the gesture of someone who had been allowed for the first time in months to feel comfort without judgment. Harold closed his eyes again, not out of exhaustion, but out of calm. The tightness that had controlled every movement earlier was gone. In its place was a softness that made him look years lighter. The stage lights dimmed a little more, turning the space warm and gentle. The audience quieted again. And for the first time since Margaret's passing, Harold stood not as a grieving widower struggling to speak her name, but as a man held by compassion, given the space to grieve without pressure and to breathe without fear. In that fragile, beautiful stillness, Harold finally felt human again. Backstage, the noise of the auditorium faded into a distant hum as the curtain fell behind them. Harold's steps were unsteady, and 2 crew members moved toward him quickly, ready to take his arms. But Keanu kept a gentle hand on Harold's back and guided him himself, moving at a slow, careful pace that allowed Harold to breathe at his own rhythm. The hallway lights were softer than the harsh stage beams, and as Harold lowered into a nearby chair, the weight of the moment finally settled over him like a heavy blanket. The first thing Harold did was apologize. He inhaled shakily, wiped at the tears still clinging to his face, and whispered that he was sorry. Sorry for breaking down, sorry for ruining the tribute, sorry for not being strong enough. His words tumbled out in fragments, trembling with shame. He held his hands together tightly as if bracing himself for disappointment or judgment. Keanu crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on Harold's forearm. His voice was soft but firm, carrying a calm certainty that pushed through Harold's breathless apologies. He told Harold there was nothing to be ashamed of, that grief didn't make him weak, and that what everyone had witnessed on stage wasn't failure. It was love, pure, unfiltered human love, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into rehearsed speeches or perfect moments. Keanu reminded him that Margaret had been the center of his world, and that speaking about her could never be easy, no matter how hard he tried to prepare. Harold listened, his lips trembling, and nodded slowly as Keanu spoke. Crew members lingered nearby, unsure whether to approach. When they finally did, they came not with the brisk professionalism typical of award shows, but with gentle sincerity. One stagehand placed a small bottle of water on the table near Harold. Another quietly handed him a fresh tissue. Their faces were softened by emotion, their usual hurried pace replaced with reverence. It was clear they had been moved far beyond the expectations of their job. A few younger actors stepped closer as well, hovering respectfully, until Harold lifted his gaze. They began expressing their gratitude, telling him that what he had shown on stage was the most sincere moment they had ever seen at an award ceremony. Their voices carried awe, not pity. They thanked him for reminding them what vulnerability looked like, what honesty in art truly meant. Harold listened to the young actors with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. He kept shaking his head as though he didn't deserve their kindness. Each compliment made him lower his gaze again, embarrassed that his most vulnerable moment had happened in front of so many people. But the sincerity in their voices slowly began to soften the tightness in his expression. When one young actress told him that she had never seen anything so brutally honest and heartbreakingly beautiful, Harold's eyes filled again, but this time the tears were gentler, born not of pain, but of being understood. Keanu stayed beside him through it all. He didn't shift into the background once others stepped forward. He didn't let anyone take his place. Whenever Harold looked overwhelmed, Keanu placed a comforting hand on his arm or shoulder, anchoring him with the same steady presence that had carried him through the moment on stage. If anyone attempted to usher Harold away or pull Keanu into a different direction, Keanu politely refused, insisting silently with his posture that he wasn't leaving Harold alone. A producer eventually approached her, expression soft and respectful. She thanked Harold for his bravery and apologized if the moment had been too heavy, but Harold quickly shook his head. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat again. Keanu stepped in, offering a gentle explanation. He told her the tribute had been meaningful, that it had honored Margaret in a way no script could have accomplished, and that Harold had given the room something they didn't even know they needed. The producer nodded with gratitude, momentarily speechless. One of the crew members then turned toward Keanu with visible admiration. He thanked him quietly for stepping in, saying that everyone backstage had felt powerless watching Harold struggle, and that Keanu's decision had changed the entire atmosphere. Others joined in with similar sentiments. A lighting technician, still wiping his eyes, told Keanu that he'd never seen anything like it in all his years working shows. A camera operator choked up as he described how even the equipment crew had stopped working to watch the moment unfold. Keanu brushed off the praise with a modest smile. He told them he hadn't done anything extraordinary, that anyone would have done the same. But everyone standing there knew that wasn't true. No one else had moved. No one else had stepped onto that stage. Only Keanu had seen Harold's collapse and responded with such instinctive compassion. Even after the crowd of crew members and young actors drifted away, Keanu remained beside Harold, refusing to let the moment lose its warmth. Harold sat quietly, hands clasped, breathing more evenly now. The shame that had weighed on him earlier had begun to dissolve, replaced by a fragile sense of safety. He looked at Keanu with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as though still trying to understand why someone would choose to stay when it would have been easier to slip away into the chaos of the show. Harold apologized once more, softer this time, almost out of habit. Keanu shook his head gently, reminding him again that grief is not a mistake. He told Harold that what happened on stage wasn't a failure, but a testament to love a man trying to honor the woman who shaped his life. Harold absorbed the words with a slow nod, finally allowing himself to believe them. Before leaving, a young actor returned and stepped close enough for Harold to hear. He told him that tonight had changed him, that seeing Harold's honesty reminded him why storytelling mattered at all. Harold's eyes softened as the young man walked away. Keanu placed a supportive hand on Harold's back. "You honored her," he said quietly, "more than any speech could." The award ceremony ended with a subdued tenderness that lingered in every corner of the auditorium, but the world outside reacted very differently. Before the show had even officially wrapped, audience members seated across the hall began uploading shaky, heartfelt clips of Keanu singing beside Harold. Some were recorded from phones held with trembling hands, others from quiet Zooms captured by people who hadn't intended to film anything until the moment overwhelmed them. Within minutes, the videos began spreading across social platforms. Like wildfire, each clip carrying the same caption in one form or another. "You need to see this." By the time Harold was being escorted home and Keanu was quietly slipping out a side exit, the internet had already erupted. Fans couldn't believe what they had witnessed. Words like healing sacred and unforgettable appeared in thousands of posts. People who hadn't watched the ceremony live began searching for the footage, hungry to understand the emotion behind the headlines that were quickly emerging. Within an hour, one fan's clip reached 1 million views. Another clip posted by a young actress in the front row showed Keanu placing his hand on Harold's shoulder just before singing. That video alone was shared across news feeds faster than any award speech that night. The moment wasn't polished or staged. It wasn't an official broadcast angle. It was raw, grainy, human, and that made it powerful. Commenters wrote that they felt the room's silence through the screen. Others said they cried instantly, even without context. Then a headline started circulating, posted first by a small entertainment account and quickly copied by larger outlets. Keanu Reeves heals an entire audience. The phrase struck something deep in people. It didn't claim he performed, it didn't say he saved the show, it said he healed, and millions agreed. Viewers around the world began sharing their own stories beneath the clip stories of parents they had lost, partners they missed, loved ones they wished they could sing to again. One comment read, "I didn't know I needed this tonight." Another said, "My husband passed away last year. This made me feel like someone understood." In living rooms, offices, and late-night bedrooms, people watched Keanu's soft, unpolished voice ease Harold's trembling and felt comfort themselves. By morning, the moment had crossed every major platform. News anchors opened their broadcasts with the clip, their voices hushed in respect rather than excitement. A morning show replayed the footage 3 times in a row, each host visibly emotional as they discussed how rare it was to witness something so genuine in a space usually defined by glamour and performance. One anchor said softly, "This wasn't an awards moment. This was a humanity moment." That line quickly became another viral quote. Editorial pieces appeared before noon. Journalists who had been in the room described the silence as wholly transformative and unlike anything the industry has ever experienced. They wrote about Harold's trembling voice, the audience rising one by one, and the way Keanu's gentle singing had shifted the atmosphere from panic to healing. Some articles focused on Harold, calling him a symbol of real grief in a world obsessed with polished appearances. Others focused entirely on Keanu's intervention, highlighting his humility, his empathy, and his refusal to make the moment about himself. Comment sections were filled with stories, thousands upon thousands of them. People wrote about the spouse they lost, the parent they missed, the friend they couldn't stop thinking about. They shared memories, regrets, and small moments of love they wished they had appreciated more. Strangers replied to each other with condolences and virtual embraces. The clip didn't just go viral, it created community. Hashtags emerged naturally without marketing or planning. Time after time. Let love breathe. Watch how Keanu heals. Each one grew by the minute as people across the globe shared what the moment meant to them. Some celebrities reposted the clip with simple captions like, "Beautiful" or "This moved me." Others shared longer reflections about grief, compassion, and the power of small acts. Meanwhile, reporters scrambled to reach Keanu for an official statement. They contacted his team, his publicist, even friends and colleagues hoping for a comment. But no one replied. Entertainment channels speculated about what he might say. Lifestyle blogs wrote pieces predicting that Keanu would likely respond with grace and humility. But the truth was much simpler. Keanu didn't say anything at all. As the world talked, debated, and cried over the moment, he quietly stepped back from the spotlight, allowing the story to rest where it belonged, with Harold and with everyone who had needed that healing moment. For the next few days, Keanu's absence from the public eye only deepened the impact of what happened. While media outlets continued calling his team for interviews, he chose quiet. No press statements, no social media posts, no follow-up commentary. He didn't appear on talk shows or respond to journalists waiting outside his home. He simply disappeared into his ordinary routines, giving the world space to feel the moment without turning it into spectacle. This silence only fueled more conversation online, but not in the way controversy usually does. Instead of criticism, people praised the humility. Commenters wrote how refreshing it was that he didn't try to capitalize on the attention, didn't reshape the narrative, didn't center himself. He made it about Harold, one user wrote. Another added, he made it about healing. The message was clear. The moment had grown larger than the award show, and Keanu treated it with the reverence it deserved. Meanwhile, Harold's family released a brief statement thanking the public for the overwhelming compassion. They wrote about how deeply Margaret had shaped Harold's life and how meaningful it was that people across the world honored her memory through the shared experience of the song. Their message, though short, resonated widely. It reminded viewers that behind the viral clip was a real man, a real loss, and a real love story that had carried across decades. News commentators began shifting the narrative away from celebrity culture and toward something broader. They spoke about vulnerability, about the quiet power of empathy, and about the way a single human gesture could ripple through millions of people. They compared the moment to a collective exhale, a reminder that in a world full of noise, sincerity still had the power to cut through everything. Clips of Harold's soft whisper captured by a close-range microphone were played on morning programs with subtitles, "You made my heart breathe again." Audiences across the country replayed that line, many saying it broke them open in a way they didn't expect. It wasn't about fame, it wasn't about the show, it was about the universal longing to feel held in moments of loss. Through it all, Keanu remained silent, and somehow his silence made the world speak louder, sharing stories of love, grief, and healing in a way few public moments ever had. The clip didn't fade with the news cycle. It became something people returned to whenever they needed comfort. And that quiet, powerful legacy grew, without Keanu ever saying another word. A week passed quietly. The world continued talking, sharing, and revisiting the viral moment. But Keanu kept his routine simple and private. He spent his mornings walking, his afternoons reading scripts he wasn't ready to answer, and his evenings quietly at home. He rarely checked the news, and when he did, he skipped over the headlines, about himself choosing instead to let the story rest without his voice added to it. One morning when he opened his mailbox, an envelope stood out among the usual stack of bills and promotional flyers. It was cream-colored, thick, and old-fashioned, the kind of paper people once used for wedding invitations or significant announcements. The handwriting on the front was shaky but deliberate, written with care. Keanu paused before opening it, sensing immediately that it carried something personal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The first words made his chest tighten. Dear Keanu. Harold's handwriting wavered, the lines uneven, as though written through pauses of emotion. He began by thanking Keanu, not in the broad, rehearsed language often used in public statements, but in a way that felt raw and deeply human. He wrote that he had spent the days after the awards ceremony trying to understand what had happened on stage, how a moment he expected to be painful and humiliating had instead become a turning point in his grieving. Harold wrote about Margaret with tenderness that seeped through every sentence. He described her laughter, her kindness, the way she would tilt her head when she listened to someone speak. He wrote about their first date, a night filled with nervous excitement. They had met at a small cafe where Harold, too, anxious to speak clearly, ended up stuttering his way through half the conversation. Margaret, noticing his nerves, reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Later that evening, as they walked home, he softly sang time after time, hoping she wouldn't notice how badly his voice shook. But she noticed, she smiled, and she sang along. Harold wrote that the song became their shared language, the melody they returned to whenever words felt too small to hold their feelings. He admitted in the letter that when he stepped onto the award stage, he believed he had lost the last piece of her. He believed nothing could bring back the comfort she once offered, until Keanu began to sing. Harold's handwriting grew shakier halfway down the page, but the emotion behind his words only deepened. He wrote that when Keanu stepped beside him on stage, he had felt something shift inside him, a feeling he couldn't name in the moment, but one that washed over him like a warm current. He described hearing the first quiet notes of the song and feeling the world dissolve around him. For a moment, he wasn't in front of thousands of people. He wasn't collapsing under the spotlight. He wasn't fighting to breathe. He was simply a man hearing the voice of someone offering comfort exactly when it was needed. Harold admitted he closed his eyes, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he wanted to let the memory of Margaret settle more deeply. He wrote that Keanu's voice didn't just echo the songs she used to sing, it carried the same calm, the same warmth, the same unspoken promise that everything would be all right, even if only for a moment. When the harmony from the audience began to rise, Harold said he felt surrounded by a tenderness he had never expected to feel again, alive or otherwise. He then wrote something Keanu paused to reread. Harold said he had spent the days after the ceremony trying to put into words why the moment mattered so much. He wrote that grief often made him feel like he was walking through fog, unable to see where his next step would land. But when Keanu sang beside him, it felt as though someone had placed a lantern in his hands, helping him see the path again, even if only faintly. He wrote that he had not expected to feel understood by someone who barely knew him. Harold described waking up the next morning and feeling different, not healed but lighter. He wrote that he went outside, sat on his porch, and listened to Time After Time on an old cassette player that still carried a faint trace of Margaret's perfume. For the first time since her passing, the song didn't break him. It held him, just like it once had. He wrote that Keanu had given him that gift without asking for anything in return. Some people comfort with speeches, Harold wrote. You comforted with presence. Those words lingered on the page, carrying more weight than any formal thank you ever could. Toward the end of the letter, Harold's handwriting grew smaller, as if he had paused many times before choosing each word. He wrote that he had replayed the moment on stage only once, not to watch himself struggle, but to understand how Keanu had stood beside him with such quiet strength. He wrote that what touched him most was not the singing itself, but the intention behind it, the way Keanu had offered comfort without asking for permission, praise, or recognition. Harold confessed that when he walked onto the stage that night, he believed he had lost the last living piece of Margaret's presence. Grief had stolen his voice, his balance, even his courage. But when Keanu began singing, he felt something return, not in the form of closure, but in the form of memory, gentle, warm, and alive. His final line made Keanu stop and read it twice. "You didn't just sing for me, you carried her memory with your voice." Keanu folded the letter slowly, holding it in both hands. For a long moment he didn't move. The house was silent around him. The morning light through the window softened the room, and Keanu let himself feel the weight of Harold's gratitude settle into his heart. Keanu sat by the window long after he had finished reading Harold's letter. The morning light was soft, filtered through thin curtains that moved gently with the breeze. The letter rested on his lap, folded neatly but still warm from his hands. He didn't rush to put it away. He let the words linger in the quiet of the room, allowing himself to feel the weight of what Harold had written. It wasn't the kind of message someone could read just once and walk away from. It needed time. It needed breath. As he sat there, memories began to surface, not in sharp flashes, but in slow, aching waves. He thought about the people he had lost, faces he hadn't seen in years, voices he hadn't heard except in memory. He thought of his father, a man whose absence left more questions than answers. He thought of the child he never got to watch grow the loss that still lived in a quiet corner of his heart. He thought of loved ones who had slipped away too soon, leaving behind a silence that sometimes felt louder than sound. Keanu understood Harold's grief in a way that didn't need explanation. Loss had shaped them both, carving out spaces inside them that never fully closed. He knew what it felt like to stand somewhere public while carrying a weight that no one else could see. He knew what it felt like to smile through the ache, and he knew exactly why he had stepped onto that stage without hesitation. It wasn't heroism, it wasn't instinct alone, it was recognition. It was the quiet knowledge of what grief does to a person, how it can collapse someone without warning. He looked down at the letter again and felt a sense of connection that surprised him. Harold's words were not just gratitude. They were a reminder that healing sometimes happens in the presence of someone who understands the language of pain. Sometimes two wounded people cross paths at the exact moment they need each other most. Keanu closed his eyes and let that truth settle. Keanu remained by the window, his gaze drifting outside, but not really focusing on anything. The world beyond the glass felt distant, muted by the quiet stillness of his thoughts. Harold's words continued echoing gently in his mind, stirring memories he usually kept tucked away. He wasn't a man who often spoke about his losses. He carried them quietly, letting them shape him without allowing them to consume him. But today, the letter opened those doors again, reminding him of all the moments that had carved silent marks into his life. He remembered nights when the grief felt heavier than usual. Nights when he sat alone with nothing but a dim lamp and the ache that came from missing people he could never see again. He remembered how small gestures, a kind message, a shared song, a simple moment of understanding had once helped him breathe again, even if only briefly. He realized that what he had given Harold on that stage wasn't extraordinary. It was what he had once needed himself. The thought softened him. It humbled him. Grief wasn't a one-sided experience. It wasn't something a person conquered entirely. It lived with you. It changed shape. It quieted for a time, then resurfaced without warning. Harold's collapse on stage reminded Keanu of moments in his own life when the weight felt too heavy to hold, moments when he wished someone would quietly place a hand on his shoulder and remind him he didn't have to carry everything alone. He looked down again at the folded letter. There was something sacred about it, not because it praised him, but because it revealed the depth of another person's love. Margaret had been Harold's anchor, his safe place, his song, and being able to help Harold reconnect with that memory, even briefly, felt like an unexpected gift placed in his hands. As the morning light shifted across the floor, Keanu felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't complete healing. It wasn't meant to be. It was a gentle reminder that even the deepest grief can be softened through shared humanity. Keanu finally lifted the letter from his lap and held it carefully as if it were something fragile. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, feeling the texture of the handwritten ink, the subtle pressure marks left by Harold's unsteady hand. This wasn't a letter written for the world. It wasn't crafted for media or polished for public eyes. It was a message from one grieving heart to another, offered with honesty and vulnerability. Across the room sat a small wooden box. It was simple, handcrafted, and worn smooth from years of use. Inside it, Keanu kept only a handful of items, notes from people who had touched his life, small tokens of gratitude, memories he never wanted to misplace. He didn't add to the box often. Only the most meaningful things earned a place there. Letters from fans who told him a film helped them through a dark time. A hand-drawn picture from a child he once met at a charity hospital. A folded poem given to him by someone he knew only briefly, but never forgot. He stood slowly and walked toward it, the letter still held gently between his fingers. When he opened the lid, the familiar scent of old paper drifted out, comforting in its own quiet way. He paused before placing the letter inside, taking a moment to read Harold's final line again, letting the words settle with full weight. "You didn't just sing for me. You carried her memory with your voice." Keanu felt those words resonate deep within him. It wasn't about being thanked. It wasn't about being praised. It was about the way love endures, how something as simple as a song can bring someone back, if only for a heartbeat. It reminded him that healing doesn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes it only requires presence. Sometimes it requires listening. Sometimes it requires a voice willing to carry someone else's memory long enough for them to breathe again. He folded the letter one final time and placed it inside the wooden box with deliberate care. Then he closed the lid, gently sealing Harold's words among the moments that had shaped his own journey. And in the quiet of his home, Keanu felt a small, steady warmth settle in his chest, a reminder that even pain can lead to connection, and even loss can bring unexpected light. The months that followed the awards ceremony unfolded gently for Harold, like a long winter finally giving way to the first signs of spring. People who had watched the tribute reached out in quiet waves. Letters arrived at his home from strangers who had seen the viral clip and felt compelled to share their own stories of love and loss. They wrote about husbands, wives, parents, and children they deeply missed. They thanked Harold for showing them that grief did not make them broken. It simply made them human. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Harold didn't shrink from these messages. He read them slowly, sometimes through tears, sometimes through soft smiles, but always with gratitude. He no longer felt alone in his sorrow. The moment on stage, painful as it had been, had opened a door for him not to step away from his grief, but to walk through it with others who understood. Soon, invitations began to arrive. A grief support organization reached out, asking if he would speak to families who had recently lost loved ones. A small charity wanted him to attend an event honoring caregivers. A film school invited him to share his story with young performers, learning how to navigate the emotional weight of storytelling. At first, Harold hesitated, unsure if he was ready to stand in front of people again. But each time he paused, he remembered Keanu's voice beside him on that stage, soft and steady, like a hand guiding him forward. When he finally accepted the first invitation, he walked into the room with trembling hands but a stronger heart. He didn't bring a speech. He didn't try to perform. He simply spoke from truth about Margaret, about loss, about the moment he thought he had collapsed forever, and about the unexpected kindness that lifted him back to his feet. He shared how a man he barely knew had given him a reason to breathe again. And the room listened not with pity, but with recognition. In that moment, Harold realized he had found a new purpose. As Harold continued accepting invitations, something remarkable began to happen. The fear that once tightened his throat whenever he stood before an audience slowly faded. He no longer felt the pressure of performing. He no longer worried about forgetting lines or losing composure. Every time he walked onto a stage, he carried with him the memory of Keanu standing beside him, steady and unshakable, singing not to impress, but to comfort. That memory became a kind of anchor, a warm reminder that vulnerability was not a flaw, but a doorway to connection. At each event, people approached him afterward with soft voices and open hearts. They thanked him for sharing the truth instead of pretending to be strong. They told him his honesty made them feel less alone. Some cried as they spoke. Others simply held his hand in silence. Harold listened to every story with the same tenderness he had once reserved only for Margaret. He found himself offering comfort in ways he never expected, through gentle words, shared memories, and the simple assurance that grief was something they could carry together. His story spread beyond the circles that invited him. Newspapers wrote follow-up articles about how Harold was helping others heal. Community organizations quoted his words. Clips of his small speeches circulated online, often accompanied by comments like, "This man inspires me," or "This helped me through a hard night." But Harold never leaned into praise. He kept every appearance grounded in sincerity. He spoke only when invited, and he never exaggerated his experience for effect. He didn't dramatize the moment with Keanu on stage. He simply shared what had happened with quiet reverence. Whenever someone asked him what gave him the courage to keep speaking, he would pause, smile gently, and say the same thing. "A man I barely knew gave me the courage to keep living." That sentence became a kind of signature, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. It reminded people that kindness doesn't need history or obligation. Sometimes one moment, one gesture can shift the course of an entire life. And Harold's life, though still touched by grief, was slowly becoming shaped by purpose. As the months continued, Harold's world gradually widened. He found himself speaking not only at formal events, but also in small community gatherings, church basements, and quiet living rooms, where people met to share the weight of their stories. He never arrived as a celebrity from another era. He arrived as Harold Bennett, a man who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and learned to keep living anyway. Each time he spoke, he felt Margaret's presence near him, not as a source of pain, but as the reason he had anything meaningful to say. What surprised Harold most was how natural it became to talk about her without breaking. The trembling that once overtook him gave way to a calm warmth. The fear that once strangled his voice loosened until he could speak freely, even laugh softly at memories that once brought him to tears. He saw these moments not as a sign that he was forgetting her, but as proof that he was carrying her forward. Harold's renewed public presence soon inspired people beyond the events he attended. Younger actors began citing him in interviews, saying his honesty reminded them that art wasn't just performance, it was truth. Grief groups shared his recordings as examples of resilience. Even those who had never met him felt touched by his journey, watching a man who had nearly collapsed under grief rise slowly, gently into a version of himself he never expected to become. And through it all, Harold never once claimed credit. He always directed the gratitude elsewhere. When someone thanked him for helping them heal, he would smile and say that healing is never a one-person effort. When asked about the awards ceremony, he spoke of it with tenderness rather than spectacle. He didn't describe the audience rising or the silence in the room. He didn't focus on the attention or the headlines. He always returned to the same simple truth. That night, someone stood beside me when I needed it. And because he did, I can stand here with you now. His slow, steady return to public life became more than a story of recovery. It became a quiet reminder that even the most fragile hearts can grow strong again when touched by kindness. The following year arrived with a gentleness Harold hadn't expected. Time had not erased his grief, but it had softened its sharpest edges, allowing him to move through his days with steadier breath and clearer purpose. As the anniversary of Margaret's passing approached, Harold felt a quiet pull in his chest, not a weight, but an invitation. He wanted to honor her, not with grand speeches or elaborate ceremonies, but with something simple and sincere, something that reflected who she truly was. He chose the Community Arts Center, where Margaret had once volunteered, a small brick building filled with old wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and murals painted by local children. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like her. It felt honest. He planned a modest gathering, inviting only the people who had known her heart former students she mentored, neighbors. She helped over the years a few fellow actors who remained close friends. A former student described her as a lighthouse, steady bright, and always pointing others toward their own potential. Every story added another layer of color to the room, filling it with the kindness she had spent a lifetime giving away. Harold listened to each memory with soft eyes. He laughed when someone shared one of Margaret's playful jokes. He wiped a tear when an older neighbor described how Margaret once stayed up all night reading to her sick child. Through it all, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. A peace born from remembering Margaret, not through the sharpness of her absence, but through the warmth of her presence. Then the door opened quietly. Keanu stepped inside without fanfare, dressed simply, no entourage, no attention drawn to himself. A few guests recognized him, but they responded with warm nods rather than excitement. He moved through the room with the same quiet grace he carried everywhere, offering gentle greetings and shy smiles. Harold's face lit up with a gratitude so deep it softened his entire posture. When Keanu reached him, Harold placed a hand over his heart before pulling him into a soft embrace. No words were exchanged at first. They didn't need any. Keanu's presence alone was an answer, a reassurance that the bond formed on that stage had not been fleeting. It had become something lasting. Harold invited him to join the small circle of guests, and Keanu listened quietly as people shared their stories. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't draw attention. He simply offered presence, the same way he had on the stage months earlier. Every person in the room understood that his being there was not an obligation, not a favor, but a sincere act of respect for Margaret and for Harold's journey. The evening grew even softer, gentler, with Keanu's quiet presence grounding it all. As the evening reached its quiet midpoint, Harold asked everyone to step outside into the small garden behind the Arts Center. The garden was simple, filled with lavender bushes, potted roses, and a single maple tree that Margaret had planted years ago. Soft lanterns hung from wooden posts, casting warm light across the pathway. The group gathered in a loose circle, their breaths rising gently into the cool evening air. At the center of the garden stood a wooden bench newly installed, its surface smooth and lightly polished. Flowers rested on either side of it, placed there earlier by the volunteers who knew what this moment meant to Harold. The bench looked humble and welcoming, as though it were waiting to hold the stories of anyone who needed a quiet place to remember. Harold stepped forward, his voice steady but tender. He spoke briefly about Margaret's love for the Arts Center, her devotion to community, and her belief that kindness was something to be shared without hesitation. Then he invited Keanu to stand beside him. Keanu approached quietly, offering Harold a reassuring glance before turning his attention to the bench. Harold placed his hand gently on the engraved plaque fixed to the bench's backrest. The guests leaned closer, reading the words as the lantern light reflected off the metal. Love returns time after time. A soft hush fell over the group. Harold explained that the phrase captured everything Margaret believed in, that love was not a single moment, not a single lifetime, but something that echoed across time, returning in unexpected ways when people opened their hearts to it. He said it was the reason he could stand here today, the reason he could breathe again, the reason he had found strength after nearly losing himself on that stage. Keanu rested a hand on Harold's shoulder, grounding him once more with quiet support. There were no cameras recording the moment, no reporters waiting for quotes, just honest remembrance shared among people who cared. The group bowed their heads for a short moment of silence, honoring Margaret's legacy. When they finally lifted their eyes again, Harold exhaled softly, a peaceful smile settling onto his face. The tribute was simple, it was intimate, and it meant everything. As the gathering of the Arts Center slowly came to an end, Keanu stepped outside into the cool evening air. The lanterns in the garden glowed softly behind him, casting gentle pockets of warm light across the path. Laughter and quiet conversation drifted from inside as guests lingered, sharing final stories of Margaret to carry home with them. Keanu paused near the entrance, slipping his hands into his pockets as he took in the peaceful scene. There was no applause, no cameras, no spotlight, just an atmosphere full of gratitude and memory held together by the people who loved Margaret deeply. Keanu looked toward the wooden bench Harold had dedicated earlier. Even from a distance, the engraved words caught the light. Love returns time after time. He read them slowly, letting their meaning settle inside him. Those words didn't just belong to Margaret's story. They belonged to every person who had loved and lost, every person who found themselves carried by the kindness of another when they thought they couldn't stand alone. The phrase felt like both a tribute and a truth, a reminder that love never truly disappears. It changes form, it reshapes itself, and it comes back when needed most. He thought of Harold standing beside him on the stage months earlier, shaking and breathless. He thought of how quickly the silence in the room had turned into a moment of collective healing. He thought of the way thousands of strangers rose in unison, offering comfort with nothing more than presence and soft voices. And he thought of Margaret, the woman whose memory had inspired the song that became something much larger than either of them could have imagined. Keanu exhaled slowly. Healing, he realized, didn't always come through speeches or carefully crafted words. It didn't always arrive wrapped in grand gestures or public acts. Sometimes healing came quietly, through a hand on a shoulder, through a shared breath, through a single act of love offered at the exact moment someone needed it. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Keanu stepped farther down the path, following the curve of the small garden. The sounds from inside the art center softened until they blended into a distant hum. Above him, the sky deepened into a quiet blue, the first evening stars pushing through the shadows. He paused beside a tree that Margaret had once helped plant during a community event. A small plaque at its base mentioned her love for nurturing life wherever she went. Keanu knelt for a moment, brushing his hand across the cool metal, imagining her gentle touch in the gesture. He didn't know Margaret well, but he knew Harold. And through Harold's grief, he had learned what she meant to him. Love that deep leaves a mark not only on the heart, but on the world around it. Tonight had made that clearer than ever. The stories shared the tears, held back the laughter that rose in small bursts throughout the room. They were all threads of the life she had woven through so many people. It made Keanu think of the people he once loved, the ones whose absence had shaped him quietly over the years. He thought of his daughter. He thought of Jennifer. He thought of the chapters of his life that had closed long before he was ready. Loss had changed him, softened him in some places, and strengthened him in others. It taught him that grief is not something to overcome, but something to carry with gentle hands. And when he saw Harold trembling on that stage months ago, he recognized the same weight, the same fear, the same kind of ache that doesn't fade, only shifts. That was why he stepped forward, not because he was brave, not because he wanted to be seen. He stepped forward because he had once needed someone to lean on, too, someone who understood the pain of trying to speak when the heart felt too shattered to form words. The garden around him felt still, as if listening. Keanu rose slowly, letting the quiet become part of his breath. Healing had no schedule, no script. It simply waited for the moment when someone was willing to share it. Keanu walked towards the exit of the garden, taking one last look at the bench, the tree, and the soft glow of the art center windows. He felt a calmness settle in his chest, the kind that arrives only after witnessing something meaningful. Tonight hadn't been about a tribute or a ceremony. It had been about two lives forever tied together by love, and about how one song meant for a single heart ended up touching countless others. As he stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk, he understood something simple but powerful. Healing doesn't always happen through speeches, applause, or perfectly chosen words. Sometimes it arrives through a small act of courage, a gentle hand on a shoulder, or a melody sung at the very moment someone feels like they're breaking. Moments like that don't erase pain, but they help carry it. Keanu took a slow breath and continued walking, letting the night wrap gently around him. Somewhere inside, he carried Margaret's memory, too passed on through Harold's love. And now to you watching this story. Have you ever witnessed a moment where kindness changed everything? What story would you like to see Keanu Reeves in next?